There is a moment in the book of Job that theologians have quietly wrestled with for millennia, a moment so stark and so uncomfortable that most sermons glide past it without stopping to let it breathe. Job has lost his children, his wealth, his health, and the respect of everyone around him. He has sat in the ash heap for chapters upon chapters, debating with friends who turn out to be wrong about God. He has cried out with raw, unfiltered grief that borders on accusation. And then, at long last, God speaks from the whirlwind, and what he says is, by any reasonable expectation, the most shocking non-answer in all of Scripture. God never tells Job why any of it happened. He never mentions Satan. He never references the wager. He never says, "I allowed this because your faithfulness was being tested, and you passed." He simply speaks of the ostrich, the wild donkey, the morning stars, and the gates of death, and somehow, inexplicably, Job is satisfied. If you have ever stood over a hospital bed, over an open grave, over the ruins of something you built with your own hands, and asked God why he was silent, then you need to understand what is actually happening in this extraordinary book. Because the answer God gives Job is not a dodge. It is the most profound theological response in the entire Bible, and almost no one is reading it correctly. To understand the book of Job with the seriousness it deserves, you must first understand what kind of text it is and what world it inhabits. The opening verses of Job 1 introduce us to a man described as integro e reto, temente a Deus, e que se desviava do mal, which in the ancient Hebrew reads as tam veyashar yere Elohim vesormera, a man of perfect moral integrity, upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. This is not ordinary language. These four qualities together constitute in the Hebrew wisdom tradition the portrait of a fully formed human being, someone who has achieved what the sages called shalom in every dimension of life. And the text makes clear that his prosperity was not incidental to this description. It was understood in the ancient Near Eastern worldview to be its visible confirmation. Wealth, children, land, and health were the signs that heaven had looked favorably upon a man. Job had all of them, and Job 1.3 tells us he was mayor do que todos os do Oriente, the greatest of all the men of the East. This matters enormously because what Satan proposes to God in the heavenly court is not merely a cruel experiment. It is a direct assault on the very theological architecture of the ancient world. The figure called the adversary, in Hebrew, has-Satan, which is a title rather than a proper name at this stage, meaning the accuser or the one who prosecutes, raises a question that cuts to the heart of every religion that has ever existed. Does Job fear God for nothing? As it is written in Job 1.9, Porventura teme jo a Deus de balde? This is the question that drives the entire book, and it is a question you are almost certainly asking about yourself without realizing it. Does human virtue have any integrity when it is inseparable from reward? Is it possible to love God not for what he gives, but for who he is? The adversary is saying essentially that transactional faith is the only kind of faith that exists. Strip away the blessings, and what remains? He is betting the answer is nothing. And what is terrifying is that God accepts the challenge, not because he does not love Job, but because he does, and because he knows something about Job that neither Job nor the adversary fully understands. The calamities that fall on Job in rapid succession at the end of Job 1 and the beginning of Job 2 are described with a literary efficiency that is itself devastating. There is barely time to breathe between the messengers. First, the oxen and donkeys are taken, and the servants killed. Before that messenger finishes speaking, another arrives. Fire from heaven consumed the sheep and the shepherds. Before he finishes, another. The Chaldeans took the camels and killed those servants too. Before he finishes, one final unbearable message arrives. The house collapsed, and all of Job's children are dead. This rapid-fire sequence is not an accident of storytelling. It mirrors the way real catastrophe works, how grief does not wait politely, how loss compounds itself before you have had a chance to process the first blow. And Job's response, recorded in Job 1:21, is one of the most theologically loaded sentences in the Bible. No saí do ventre de minha mãe e no tornarei para lá. O Senhor o deu e o Senhor o tomou. Bendito seja o nome do Senhor. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Commentators throughout history have lauded this as the pinnacle of faith, but the book is not finished with Job yet, and neither is the adversary. The second round of the heavenly dialogue in Job 2 escalates the stakes dramatically. Having failed to break Job's confession of praise, the adversary proposes something worse: touch his bone and his flesh. Physical suffering, he argues, will expose what prosperity could not. Mas estende a tua mão e toca-lhe nos ossos e na carne, e verás se não blasfema contra ti na tua face, as it is written in Job 2:5. And God permits it, with one restriction: Job's life must be preserved. What follows? The terrible sores covering Job's body, the ash heap outside the city where the diseased and outcast sat, his wife's bitter counsel to curse God and die, the arrival of 3 friends who sit in silence for 7 days because his suffering is so great they cannot speak. All of this is setting the stage for the real drama of the book, which is not about Job's suffering but about Job's theology, and specifically about what he believes God owes him by way of explanation. It is worth pausing here to consider the cultural and geographical context that surrounds this story. Job lived in the land of Uz, a region associated by ancient tradition with the territory east of Israel, possibly Edom or the northern Arabian Peninsula, outside the covenant community of Israel entirely. This is not an Israelite story in the narrow ethnic sense. It is a universal story, and that is part of its genius. The wisdom literature of the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamian texts like the Babylonian Dialogue of a Man with His God, to Egyptian reflections on innocent suffering, all circled around the same inescapable problem. If the gods are just and powerful, why does the righteous person suffer? The book of Job enters this ancient conversation and refuses to give the easy answers that the surrounding cultures had produced. It insists on wrestling with the question rather than dissolving it. And the fact that its protagonist is not an Israelite suggests that the problem of innocent suffering and the question of whether God owes us explanation is not a parochial religious issue, but the deepest question of human existence, regardless of one's covenant status or religious identity. The long central section of the book, from Job 3 through chapter 37, is a prolonged and extraordinary poem in which Job and his 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, debate the nature of divine justice. The friends represent the dominant theological consensus of the ancient world, a framework that scholars call the principle of retributive justice, or more informally, the doctrine of exact retribution. Their argument, stated in various ways across dozens of chapters, can be summarized simply: God always blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. Therefore, if Job is suffering, Job must have sinned. The logic is airtight within its own premises, and it sounds at first like sound theology. Eliphaz appeals to visions and experience in Job 4 and 5. Bildad appeals to tradition in Job 8. Zophar appeals to divine wisdom in Job 11. Each argument is crafted with the confidence of men who believe they understand how God works, and each argument is, at its core, an attempt to protect God's reputation by destroying Job's. They are doing what religious people have done in every generation since, explaining suffering by locating fault in the sufferer. What is remarkable, and this is one of the most startling features of the book, is that Job refuses to accept their framework, even under the crushing weight of his circumstances. Job does not say, as a smaller man might, "You are right, I must have sinned. I accept my punishment." He insists on his integrity with a ferocity that borders on arrogance. He cries out in Job 13:15, "Ainda que ele me matasse, nele esperaria. Todavia, os meus caminhos sustentarei perante ele." Even if God kills me, I will hope in him, but I will defend my ways to his face. This is the paradox at the heart of Job's faith. He refuses to let go of God, even while refusing to accept a theological explanation of God's behavior that he knows to be false. He is not the patient, submissive saint of popular imagination. He is a man who loves God enough to argue with him, to drag him into court if necessary, to demand that justice be answered on the merits. And it is precisely this quality, this insistence on honest engagement over pious pretense, that God will later vindicate. A young man named Elihu, whose speeches appear in chapters 32 through 37, enters the dialogue after the three friends have run out of arguments. Elihu is angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God, and angry at the three friends for failing to adequately answer Job. His speeches are longer and more philosophically sophisticated than those of the other friends, and they introduce some genuinely important theological ideas, particularly the notion that suffering may serve a disciplinary and refining purpose rather than a purely punitive one. An idea that will find full expression much later in the New Testament, in passages like Romans 5:3-4 and James 1:3-4. But Elihu, like the others, ultimately remains within a framework that Job's situation has already broken open. He is still trying to explain God rather than encounter him. He is still trying to contain the divine within a rational system, which is precisely the error that the whirlwind will expose. And then, in Job 38:1, something shifts the entire register of the book. Então respondeu o Senhor a Jó, do meio do redemoinho. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. What God says, and what he does not say, is where we must slow down and read with extraordinary care, because the theology of the whirlwind speeches in Job 38 through 41 is frequently misunderstood as divine bullying, as God appearing in overwhelming power and essentially saying, "I'm bigger than you, so stop asking questions." This reading is not only wrong, it misses the entire point of the encounter. God does not come to silence Job. He comes to answer him, but the answer is not a proposition. It is a vision, beginning with the rhetorical question, "Onde estavas tu quando eu lancei os fundamentos da terra?" in Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? God takes Job on a tour of creation's complexity, wildness, and magnificent strangeness. He asks about the storehouses of snow, the Pleiades and Orion, the wild ox that will not be tamed, the war horse that exults in battle, the hawk and the eagle. He describes animals that have no obvious utility for human civilization, the ostrich that abandons her eggs and yet survives, laughing at horse and rider because God has made her so, as it is written in Job 39:13-18. He speaks of behemoth and leviathan, creatures of such formidable power that the very description of them dismantles the human illusion of control. This is not evasion. This is the most radical theological argument possible. The universe is far larger, far stranger, and far more complex than the framework that both Job's friends and, in a subtler way, Job himself had been using to adjudicate God's behavior. The friends had shrunk God to the size of a principle, a cosmic vending machine that dispensed blessing in exchange for righteousness and suffering in exchange for sin. Job had shrunk God to the size of a defendant who owed him a hearing. God's response from the whirlwind expands the frame until both positions collapse under the weight of reality. The God who measured the earth's foundations, who stores the snow for times of trouble, who satisfies the raven's hunger, who tilts the waterskins of the heavens. This God is not navigable by the kind of theological calculus anyone in the book has been applying. Not the Friends, not Job, not even Elihu with his more sophisticated framework. And yet, and this is the detail that changes everything, God does not leave Job in despair. He does not simply overwhelm him with incomprehensibility and walk away. Job's response in Job 40:5 is one of submission, yes, but the second response in Job 42:5 is something far more profound. Pelo ouvido te ouvia, mas agora os meus olhos te veem. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. This is a conversion, not a defeat. Job has moved from a theology of propositions about God to a direct, unmediated encounter with the living God. The suffering did not produce this encounter, but the suffering created the conditions in which no theoretical framework could protect him from it. When every comfortable explanation has been stripped away, when there is nothing left between you and the raw, incomprehensible fact of God, then seeing becomes possible in a way it never was before. This is what the book of Job is ultimately about. Not why suffering exists, not what we deserve, but whether our theology is large enough, honest enough, and humble enough to survive contact with the actual God, rather than the God we have constructed to serve our need for order. The denouement of the book in Job 42 contains a stunning reversal that the Christian tradition has not always handled well. God speaks to Eliphaz the Temanite, the leader of the three friends, and says something that must have landed like a thunderclap. A minha ira se acendeu contra ti e contra os teus dois amigos, porquanto não falastes de mim o que era reto, como o meu servo Jó. As it is written in Job 42:7, My wrath is kindled against you and your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. This is the theological verdict of the entire book, delivered by God himself. The friends, with all their orthodox-sounding arguments, had not spoken rightly about God. Job, with all his protests and complaints and near accusations, had spoken rightly. How is this possible? Because Job, in all his anguish, never stopped addressing God directly. He never turned away. He never substituted a theology of God for God himself. He raged, he wept, he demanded, but he demanded from God, not from the void. The friends, meanwhile, had been so busy defending a theological system that they had lost sight of the living person in front of them, and in doing so, they had distorted the character of the God they thought they were representing. This is the most pastorally important teaching in the entire book, and it has enormous implications for how the church approaches suffering. When we insist on giving theological explanations to people who are in the middle of their ash heap, when we hurry past the silence and the grief and the terrible not knowing with Bible verses that are technically correct but pastorally catastrophic, we are doing exactly what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did. We are speaking wrongly about God, not because our doctrines are false, but because we are substituting our doctrines for the God who is present in suffering in ways that defy doctrinal categorization. The 7-day silence that Job's friends kept at the beginning, before they opened their mouths, was actually the most theologically accurate thing they did in the entire book. It is when they began to explain that they went wrong. The ministry of presence, the willingness to sit in the ash heap alongside someone without filling the silence with theology, is not the absence of pastoral care. It is, according to the very verdict of God recorded in the final chapter of this book, the closest thing to speaking rightly about God that any of us can offer in the face of someone else's unspeakable suffering. The New Testament does not quote the book of Job extensively, but it inhabits the same spiritual territory. The letter of James in the 5th chapter and 11th verse references Job directly, saying that those who endured are called blessed, and pointing to Job as an example of patient endurance and to the Lord's outcome. porque o Senhor é muito misericordioso e piedoso. But this reference, while important, can be misread as simple moral encouragement. Hang in there, as Job did. The deeper connection runs through the Psalms of Lament, through the confessions of Jeremiah, who cursed the day of his birth in Jeremiah 20:14, and most powerfully, through the suffering of Jesus of Nazareth, who cried from the cross in the words of Psalm 22:1, Deus meu, por que me abandonaste? My God, why have you forsaken me? Here is the Son of God himself, in the culminating moment of human history, asking the question that Job asked, and receiving, in that moment, the same apparent silence. The cross of Christ does not solve the problem of suffering in the sense of giving us a logical explanation for why innocent people experience pain. What it does is something far more radical. It places God inside the suffering. It makes the divine response to human anguish not an explanation, but a presence, not a theology, but an incarnation. This is the trajectory that Job anticipates. When Job cries out in chapter 19 with the famous words, porque eu sei que o meu Redentor vive, e por último se levantará sobre o pó, e depois de consumida esta minha pele, ainda em minha carne verei a Deus. As it is written in Job 19:25-26, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the dust, and after this my skin is destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. He is not simply expressing personal hope. He is reaching across the centuries toward a resolution that his own lifetime could not provide, a vindication that would only become visible in the resurrection of the crucified Messiah. The book of Job, read within the full canon of Christian scripture, is not simply wisdom literature about coping with suffering. It is a proto-evangelical text, a witness to the conviction that innocence can be crushed, and yet somehow, in ways that confound every human calculation, will be vindicated by a Redeemer who lives. The resurrection of Jesus is the cosmic answer to the question that the book of Job raises, but cannot, within its own horizon, fully resolve. God vindicates the innocent not by explaining their suffering before the fact, but by raising them after it. What then do we do with the silence? What do we do with the fact that God never explains himself, never tells Job about the wager, never says, it was worth it, or it was a test, or here is the purpose behind your pain? We do what Job did. We learn to be content with an encounter rather than an explanation. We learn that the God who speaks from the whirlwind is not a God who fits into our theological frameworks, no matter how carefully we have constructed them. We learn that faith, in its most honest form, is not the confident assertion of doctrines, but the stubborn refusal to let go of God even when, especially when, he does not behave as we expect. We learn that the right question to bring to suffering is not why, but who. Not what kind of cosmic principle is at work, but what kind of God is present, and whether we trust him enough to remain in his presence, even when his presence is indistinguishable from silence. And we learn that this trust, this fierce and terrible clinging to a God who refuses to be managed or explained, is not a sign of weakness. According to the verdict of the book of Job itself, it is precisely what speaking rightly about God looks like. The restoration of Job's fortunes at the end of the book, described in Job 42:10-17, has often been treated as the happy ending that makes the suffering worth it, and this reading is deeply problematic. It risks reducing the entire book to exactly the kind of transactional theology that the Friends represented, as if God's ultimate defense against the accusation of injustice is simply to give back double what was taken. But the text does not present it this way. The restoration comes after the theological climax, not as the climax itself. The climax is the whirlwind encounter. The climax is, my eye sees you. The restoration is a sign of God's character, of his capacity and desire to bless. But it is not the vindication of Job's suffering, and it does not retroactively give that suffering a purpose that Job can articulate in tidy, satisfying terms. The children who died are not the same children who are born afterward. The grief of a parent does not transfer to a new set of children without remainder. The book does not pretend otherwise, and in that refusal to offer a clean, satisfying resolution, it remains startlingly honest about the nature of loss in a way that centuries of easy preaching have tried to paper over. What the book of Job offers the church is not comfort of the cheap kind. It offers something rarer and more valuable: permission to be honest, permission to sit in the ash heap without pretending it is not ash. Permission to argue with God, to weep before God, to demand from God, not because God is required to answer on our terms, but because this kind of fierce, honest engagement is itself a form of faith, and apparently the form of faith that God prefers over tidy, careful, doctrinally correct silence. The friends spoke wrongly about God by speaking rightly about God too soon. Job spoke rightly about God by refusing to say anything about God that he did not actually believe in the depths of his being. And in a world full of suffering that defies easy explanation, full of cancer diagnoses and stillborn children and marriages that collapse and faith communities that wound the people who trusted them, we need a theology that can hold all of that without flinching. The book of Job is that theology. Not as a set of propositions about why suffering exists, but as a witness to a God who is present in the whirlwind, who is large enough to hold our anger and our grief and our unanswered questions, and who, in ways that we will not fully understand on this side of eternity, is working something in us and through us that no comfortable life could ever produce. The most unsettling answer in the Bible turns out not to be an answer at all. In the sense that we usually mean when we demand answers, it is a theophany, an appearance of God. And it asks only one thing of us in return: to stop insisting that we could have done better, to trust that the God who laid the foundations of the earth, who knows the way to the dwelling of light and the place where darkness lives, as it is written in Job 38:19, who feeds the ravens when they cry to him and who loosens the belt of Orion, to trust that this God, who is simultaneously more powerful and more tender than anything our theology has yet been able to contain, is not indifferent to our suffering, but is doing something in it that will only become clear when we, like Job, have moved from hearing about him to actually seeing him. That day is coming. Until then, we hold on, we argue if we must, we weep without shame, and we refuse, above all, to let go. If this teaching has stirred something deep in you, if it has met you in a place of pain, or challenged the way you have been thinking about God and suffering, or given you permission to be more honest in your faith than you thought you were allowed to be, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you are watching or listening from, your city, your country, the corner of the world where you are sitting with these questions, and share with us which moment in this study struck you most powerfully. Your voice matters to this community, and your story of faith in the middle of the not knowing is a testimony that someone else, sitting in their own ash heap, in their own silence, desperately needs to hear.